We're all good. Cool. U.S. treaties with indigenous people represent the original form of anthropogenic environmental change through displacement of forced migration. Settler colonialism destroyed the ability for indigenous people to interact with their environment. Treaty relationships have been the essential tool for this to occur. Climate change thus represents a critical opportunity to raise an outstanding responsibility owed by the settler state. White 16. Indigenous peoples may experience heightened vulnerability because climate change impacts overlay political relations. The formation of these political relations and settler colonialism is itself an infliction of anthropogenic environmental change on indigenous peoples. Colonialism is inseparable from anthropogenic environmental change. Broad environmental change has local implications for human societies because they have to adjust to new ecological conditions. Depending responsibilities and responsibilities that settler states have for some time have yet to fulfill and figure crucially in explaining why indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to climate change. Current discussions about climate change could be opportunities to raise the issue of outstanding responsibilities that settler states have owed for hundreds of years. The current climate change ordeal is part of the colonization process. Indigenous institutional system works on with the U.S. attention for settlement. Treaties change the way in which indigenous people can move with the seasons, shifting environmental conditions. Another impact was to exclude indigenous peoples from areas that may be culturally sacred. Treaties inflicted a form of anthropogenic environmental change tools as settler colonialism contributed to the erasure of indigenous life through climate change impacts. Treaties forced the removal of indigenous people to places far away. The Cherokee Nation was burdened with having to completely reorganize its entire society. Industrial development of the St. Lawrence River created forms of pollution that threatened tribal members from consuming traditional foods. U.S. settlers had to liquidate tribal land holdings and private property for its imposition based on private property demanded indigenous people adjust immediately to a foreign cultural political system. The U.S. sought to terminate indigenous sovereignty. Termination represents an abjection of whatever political means that indigenous people had left. Political relations between the U.S. and indigenous peoples and indigenous capacity to adapt or not, like those we discussed today with respect to climate change and existing political frames, result in a neoliberal reinvestment logic that reduces indigenous political demands to investment opportunities. This actively neutralizes the radical potential of ongoing struggles for decolonization. Green 15. Relationship between indigenous people and settler state remains fraught due to ongoing violence. Indigenous people advocated for decolonization and a suitable land-based response. Settler governments reframe requests as opportunities for investment. Holistic decolonial approaches give way to an investment rationale used to bypass demands for self-determination. The nation state seeks financial return speeches and policy represent key sides of a joining struggle over the principles and values of reconciliation. The settler state deploys investment logic to ensure the containment of indigenous claims. These demands returns to the social debt owed to indigenous people that undercut the spirit of restitution and justice grievance and redress become financialized to contain claims to self-determination. Establish private assimilation is assumed acceptable because it supposedly ensures prosperity. Settler state should be understood as an ideological project to reduce indigenous difference to an ethnicity that can be subsumed. Neoliberalism functions genocidally through a process of regime replacement. Resource extraction projects have resulted in the destruction of indigenous territory, culture, and identity. Social welfare is increasingly privatized by encouraging people to see themselves responsible for their own well-being. Redress through the economic frame increases the potential for imposition of capitalist solutions and delegitimizes grievance to legitimize the emancipatory capacities of capital. Instead, treaties can be a cipher, a critical site for decolonization. A political strategy oriented around treaty praxis opens critical space to challenge quotidian forms of settler colonial violence like residential schooling by exposing the law as a smokescreen for genocide. Senev 11. Residential schooling, like other state strategies, genocide did profound violence to treaty relationship between treaties can return to such abusive practices, but also turns to critical analysis on colonial mechanism that works to transform treaty into a smokescreen for genocide. Commitment to good treaty relationship can open a critical space for challenging quantitative and institutionalized operation of how this commitment serves as a useful way of linking the work of challenging racism to foregrounding the imperative to decolonize and restore sovereignty. Sovereignty, a represented opportunity excluded by settler institutions. Sovereignty need not be shackled to its European definition. Indigenous understanding of sovereignty is not state, it's not hierarchical, and inclusive relational and spiritual sovereignty is contested of political origin. I am in favor of organizing on the basis of a shared interest in treaty relationship over a mutual commitment to sovereignty. Treaties are born to anti-racist politics because the ground upon which redress is on. Treaties also the space the state is intended to act in appropriate meaning. The term to treaty is important in terms of solidarity formation because it presents discursive spaces where we can begin to explore relationships between the settler and racist state. It suits the status quo to present an image of a stable settler nation. A stable settler nation is a nation resistant to a good treaty relationship. Multicultural inclusive was presented as the seal of South Alpha relief, and so we must resist vacant conciliatory language of the parade of ethnic difference. The critical thing is focus attention on decolonizing treaty, turn from an understanding of treaty, a historical artifact based on European notion of American freedom, then move toward Aboriginal philosophy of the treaties and process of making keeping good relations, refuse to miss the treaty does not concern us, identifies treaty citizens and refuse liberal strategies of tolerance and inclusion at the expense of more difficult tasks for formative change. Treaty is the space where power is negotiated. Now, treaty praxis provides an essential basis for unsettling the naturalness of settler subjectivity and mythology with regards to the law. It can animate decolonizing possibilities in the present. Pillar 16. Tensions point to a principle of decolonizing treaty practice. Non-indigenous people should be willing to loosen our grasp when treaties familiar to us and remain open to being unsettled by other interpretations. Any attempt to fix the meaning of the treaties disarticulates them from the never-ending process of learning and relearning what the demand of us here and now. The treaties, a covenant represents the force of the everyday set of evolving relations that cannot be determined in advance, but instead must be lived, enacted, and reenacted through time, space, and specific ratings of its ongoing meaning. The recursiveness of treaties as understood by indigenous peoples is a process to be made and reaffirmed. This recursive quality provokes unbridled anxieties in settler citizens and governments invested in settling the matter of the treaty once and for all. Treaty history is multiple, contradictory, and ever-shifting. It demands an acknowledgement of one's position as benefactor and entails remembering and carrying forward ancient principles, recursive obligations, and responsibilities from the past into the future. Decolonizing treaties while interrogating and debunking racist assumptions that animate our received nation of treaty history and perpetuate our refusal to acknowledge treaty obligations. The process entails taking up indigenous readings of the treaties point to treaty. Decolonization is a rigorously open-ended process that demands we continually interrogate the terms on which we come to know the treaties, looking always to unsettle our secure understandings that settler colonialism operates in a state of precarity, constantly stabilizing itself by demonstrating the possibility of accommodating indigenous claims. The affirmative pushes this claim to its extreme to exacerbate a crisis of legitimacy, exposing the groundlessness of settler sovereignty and the indistinction between imperial violence and legal accommodations. Political strategies that are oriented around treaty contestation are essential decolonizing work because they place the terms of engagement themselves into crisis. Rifkin 9. Doing so would foregone the very unilateral will of theoretically limitless imperial violence on which U.S. territoriality rests, exacerbate the very structural crisis of legitimacy that Tobas and sovereignty work to stimulate, to present U.S. superintendent a function of brute force would undercut the very legitimizing aim of the arguments in which sovereignty is employed authority to ever cover the inability of U.S. law to grant itself the ground of the nation. The citation of sovereignty is a restless performance in which the failure to find normative foundation on which to rest the legitimacy of national jurisdiction remains a nagging source of anxiety. The legalism of inherent sovereignty draws attention away from the untenability of the U.S.'s overriding claim to sovereignty itself. If the notion of inherent sovereignty is somewhat of a placeholder, it provides a discursive entry point to be occupied by native peoples in ways that expose the domination of play in the deployment of the topos of sovereignty by the settler state. The discourse of sovereignty can be utilized to deconstruct U.S. rule by illustrating how the settler state exerts a monopoly of the production of legitimacy. The counter-citation of sovereignty or reveal and contest the operation of such a monopoly by drawing attention to the organizing and distinction between force and law and Indian policy. The operation of the geopolitical state of accession. What I've been arguing is that sovereignty itself is empty, a topological placeholder through which to displace the paradox of asserting domestic authority. The above comments offer another option, namely deconstructing the dynamics of settler state power, problematizing the way it seeks to generate legitimacy for itself by unpacking and laying bare the logical and legal emptiness of sovereignty. The space open is precisely that which has been placed in the state of exception, emphasizing the normative crisis over which the topos of sovereignty is stretched does not so much make room for indigenous principles within Euro-American terminology. The institutions has refused in toto the right claimed by the state to assess and adjudicate native governments, drawing attention to the state's inability to ground Indian policy and anything other but the forced incorporation of native person in the land and the nation, the assertion of native autonomy, threats to disrupt the jurisdictional imaginary and potential ruptures contained by the citation of sovereignty, a concept whose substance to shifting and out of which a classificatory scheme to determine the institutional intelligibility of native identities. It claims it might be possible to occupy the contradiction in ways that neither endorse the category and disown it as an imposition of the alien norm, nor translate indigenous traditions into its terms. Instead, the status can be used as a discursive entry point to highlight the groundlessness of U.S. claims to native land, the impossibility of reconciling Indian policy, drawing attention to the difficulty of valuing the incorporation of native peoples in the mapping of the jurisdictional geography of the state, rather than trying to contain the geopolitical difficulties that indigenous occupancy generates for the imaginary of the settler state. Treaties can serve as sites of negotiation, not simpler over particular concrete issues, but the terms of engagement themselves. The counter-citation of sovereignty can work to disrupt the attendant meta-political matrix through which native identities are produced and managed. Emphasizing the location of native peoples at the threshold between law and violence opens the state of exception to the possibility of self-determination, which indigenous polities cease to be axiomatically enfolded within the ideological and institutional structures of the settler state.
Good.
Yeah.
You say sovereignty is an empty placeholder. So how does the 1AC promote decolonization through like highlighting claims?
What do you mean highlighting? Like
you just said that you
pointing out that it's illegitimate. Yeah. Right. So the Rifkin evidence says that there's a need for legal legitimacy on which the settler state rests.
Why is there a need for legal?
Because we see it in the restless, iterative performance of the law.
Who is we?
The settlers.
Who is the settler?
The settler is a person who brings and imposes their own political system and mode of sovereignty wherever they travel.
Are you the settler?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So what does the 1AC do to promote decolonization?
So we have 3 pieces of evidence that are about the role of settlers in decolonizing work. The treaty praxis that we engage in is something that necessarily calls together both sides of the indigenous settler equation, because
how do you
it
call
is the
together
site.
Both sides?
No, the treaty calls together both of those positions because it is the site of power at which they meet and negotiate. Now, our argument is that there is a European notion of this treaty as a static artifact. Each group has a right to a claim, and then they negotiate.
How do you remove it from its static interpretation?
Yeah, so that's the part about the recursiveness of the treaty. Our argument is that there's a responsibility that states are willing to accept for climate change impacts in the future, but not a recursive obligation to the past. The Hiller evidence says that asserting that outstanding pending responsibility unsettles the notion of a fixed treaty because it's an obligation that continually impinges upon the claims that the state makes.
Sure. So I guess, like, what is the impact of this act?
The impact is settler colonialism. Our cards at the top describe processes of
colonialism.
Settler colonialism is the political system established by the settlers' colonization of a new land.
Okay, cool. Do you defend like treaties? Do you defend pedagogy as being good? Like, what will the YC defend?
I'm not sure what you mean, like treaties good. Our argument is that the treaty is a site at which political power is interpreted and negotiated. We think we have a particular praxis for engaging with that. You vote AF
because
for
you engage with it.
You vote AF for a praxis of treaty contestation that demands recursive obligations on the settler state.
Does the contestation ever end?
Our evidence says that it's a process that's open-ended.
Open-ended. What does that mean?
It means that the obligation, is recursive. It can't be settled. It can't ever be finally determined.
If it can't be settled?
Because RAF doesn't attempt to settle the responsibility.
So it doesn't do anything.
RAF is a calling on the state for that responsibility, calling on the settler for an outstanding pending obligation that unsettles the notion of the treaty.
So you call on
to be open doesn't mean it's never ending. Our Rifkin evidence
just said it was never ending.
No, it didn't. It was never ending.
Let me just stand up. That's cool.
Black is driven through psychic integrations that drive the libido means of negrophobia and negrophilia, which instruction claims to how individuals experience violence. Fullerton and 14 ordinary white citizens, Asian citizens, Native Americans. One little example of how this conundrum paradox affects the ways in which we speak. So white people are so-called allies of color, the problem in the liberal economy, which is say to collect unconscious everybody else. And if we were to actually understand it better, we would understand that blackness is always already criminalized, and the collective unconscious, our problems one of complete captivity from birth to death and coercion. At the starting point of our interaction with the state, with ordinary white citizens, we can start to see the policing and mutilation aggressively towards black men being a form of psychic death and well-being for the rest of the world, then we can reformulate the problem, begin to take a much more iconoclastic response to this idea for the quality of life every other group lives in the context of violence, which is what I would call for a sort of psychological grounding wire, which means that they can write a sentence about why they are experiencing that violence. Native Americans experiencing violence because an ongoing strategy of colonization. White feminists can say this is an ongoing tactic within the strategy of patriarchy. This is the ongoing tactic of a strategy for human renewal. The violence against us becomes a tactic within the strategy to secure humanity's place. It's not a tactic in an ongoing strategy to take our land away or to take our rights away. We never had any rights. Our psyche does not obey the objective laws of the structure. We exist in external super violence and internal soup, which is self-hatred. One of its main components, the structure by which human beings are recognized by other human beings and incorporated into a community of beings is anti-slave, and slavery is something that has consumed blackness and Africans, making it impossible to divide slavery from blackness. And blackness is a time of humanity's paradigm constricted by an orthodox vertices of negrophobia and necrophilia that structurally does not exist within a temporality that can be reconciled within the epistemological regime of cultural contingent transgressions. Historical time marks stasis and change within a master's prerogative of precarious rationality. However, one cannot know a plenitude of blackness distinct from the ontological division of the human. Therefore, the social political climate of the 1HC should not be confused. The anti-time of modernity in which the slave and non-blacks are integrated into is what extends the pathogenic violence. Orders in 16. One theorizes structural violence that assumes black people as being homogenous with the structural violence that subjugates Native Americans, the working class, and post-colonials. One fails to understand how the violence of settler occupation, labor's assumption has a utility that anti-black violence is not. One begins to think rationally about violence. All forms of revolutionary thought and action since the late 1970s, the difference between a politics of culture and a culture of politics more invested in politics, exploring the pre-conscious interests of subjects in various social formations than in the structural positionality of those subjects, their cultural or gender-oriented identity of desire to access civil society expands its parameters inclusive of marginalized identity. This scholarship often presents itself as earth-shattering, never concerning the cultural contributions of black people across the diaspora, how and why cultural offerings can be recognized and coming from people these offer. Those offerings invariably transposed in the collective unconscious as being extensions of the master's prerogative. What is a black integrity is vouchsafed by its absent species divide, a change in the way we think about and theorize the constituent elements of diaspora. We had considered Africa to have some kind of conceptual integrity, territorial, imaginary plenitude. This other, if one tilts not a project which pathologizes black people for being inhuman, but a project which pathologizes humanity towards violent consumption of blackness. There's no epistemological way to think about solution and blackness together unless you call for the end of the world. The 1948 Palestinian exodus, Nakba, dispersed people from a homeland, not a continent. This is very different than the dispersal of African along Arab and later European slave ratcheting down to the territory, the community and filial territory, the domestic spirit to the body. There is no skeletal cartographic abstraction in which you could say this story belongs to the person who happens. If you on the left will consider the pathologizing subject, that is not what happens today. Now that most folks think that slavery is the thing of the past, every black person in Africa had to negotiate captivity, becoming agents of European and Arab slave traders, throwing themselves overboard. A carceral continuum. The body doesn't exist for black men or black women. Every time space is black, and you see them treated as the absence of the world, civil society's libido investment in everyone else. Few people to think against the United States. They normally think in terms of improving or correcting the discriminatory practices invested in accessing the expansion of civil society, and genuinely opposed to the notion that civil society is a killing machine. The antagonism between blacks and the world is a problem of vision. Police don't write up big dossiers in theoretical framework for black people. What people fear is the presence of black bodies. People are terrorized by blacks. Negrophilia and negrophobia are the same psychic myths in the very space of captivity within debatery. Suture is a kind of violence that allows for the liberal left to disavow the very structurally imposed vertices of anti-black violence. This is Martin on Section 2003. Leftist approaches that come as close to a radical critique as any already fall short. The liberal ethos looks at racism something characteristic of the individual that can be solved at the level, social level through education, democratic procedure. Anti-colonialist thinking subordinates the issue of racism to presume potentialities of individual development. The radical critiques assume the issue of racism promises the future transformations of the power relations, to which deracialization is the further stumbling back and forth perceived by intricate political and historical processes, or by socializing questions of subjectivity and agency attributes to lower preoccupations of white socializing to mere racism. What needs to be from the grass of white supremacy is left entirely out of the account. The name of the epiphenomenal or the over-determining and animus is postulated as if there was something at the center of white supremacy, too adamantine, off of which the utmost Western analytic thought slides hopelessly towards the simplicity, the personal, or the institutional, the supposed secrets. White supremacy gets fluid and spectacular displays of mythology and instrumentality. The left's anti-racism becomes his passion, but his passion gives it away. It signifies passive acceptance of the idea that race is not central to the social structure, the system of social meanings and categorization is the same passive apparatus of whiteness that in its mainstream guise actively for forgets that it owes existence to the killing and terrorizing those it racializes for the purposes expelling them from the human fold. In the same gesture, forgetting is the passivity of bad faith that tacitly accepts what goes without saying. The postulates of white supremacy and affirmatives willingness to confer recognition through the settler state does not change the existing social relations that replicates the master-slave relationship between settler and the colonized. The material psychological effects of settlerism must be confronted by the colonized, or the relationship extraction and dispossession will continue through capitalist exploitation. This is Coulthard and 7. Fanon was unambiguous with respect to locating the cause of the inferiority complex of colonized subjects in a colonial social structure. A change in the social structure will not guarantee a change in the subjectivities of oppressed. Fanon's insight into the interdependent yet semi-autonomous nature of the two fastest colonial powers, correct in dumping all our efforts into alleviating institutional structural impediments, whether redistributive or recognitive, may not do anything to undercut the forms of unfreedom related to misrecognition and traditional. Since Fanon argued the dialectical progression to reciprocity in relation of recognition is frequently undermined in the colonial setting. By that fact, unlike the subjugated slave and Hegel's phenomenology, many colonized societies no longer have to struggle for the freedom and independence is often negotiated and achieved through constitutional members simply declared by the white settler states, even in the inessentiality of servitude, are set free by the master. One day, the white master, without recognition, recognized the Negro slave. It is through struggle that imperial subjects come to the rid of the arsenal complex is driven into the core of their being through the colonial process. Struggle serves the mediating force through which the colonized come to share their colonial identities, restoring them into the proper place, therefore foreclosing realization of authentic freedom. This fight is carried out in a manner that does not pose a foundational challenge to the background structures of colonial power. Then the best colonized can hope for is white liberty, and white justice. That is value secreted by their masters without transforming the struggle, constituting an integral aspect of decolonization. The indigenous population not only remain subject to imperial rule insofar as they have not gone through a process of purging the cycle of existential complexes battered into them over the course of the colonial experience, a process of strategic desubjectification. The colonized will have failed to reestablish themselves as truly self-determining, that is, of the creators of terms and values by which we are to be recognized. Mutual dependency appears to be the background condition that ensures the dialectic progress towards reciprocity. Fanon works reminds us that the problem with this formulation is that when applied to actual struggles for recognition between hegemonic, subaltern, and communities, mutual character dependency rarely exists. There is no mutual dependency in terms of need for desire or need or desire for recognition in the context of master. That is, the colonial state and state society does not require recognition from the previously self-determined communities upon which its territorial, economic, and social infrastructure is constituted. Rather than leading to a condition of reciprocity, the dialectic either breaks down the explicit non-recognition of the equal status of the colonized population, or with the strategic domestication of the terms of recognition in such a way that the foundational colonial relationship remains relatively undisturbed. And the answer is refuse the freedom of the winning seat because the vote happens to be participatory, the fungibility of aesthetics. The affirmative assumes that it can be liberatory, but it's only another tool for whites to use blacks and leave them in the places of Fullerton. 10 reparations suggest a conception of coherent loss of land, labor, power. In other words, there has to be some form of articulation between the party that has lost and the party that has gained for reparations. To make sense, no such articulation exists between the black and the world. This is why I support the reparations movement. But my emphasis, my energies, my points of attention on the word movement. I support the movement because I know it's a movement toward the end of the world, a movement toward catastrophe and epistemological coherence, institutional integrity. I support the human aspect of it because I know that repair is impossible. Any struggle that can act as a stick apart to the world demanding all that it cannot give, which everything is a movement towards something so blindly new that it cannot be imagined. This is the only thing I would say.
Ready?
Yeah.
First card says that the native, the woman, etc. have human status because they can explain their violence. That the system of colonization grants a coherence to the native. In what sense does it cohere a subjectivity for
i.e. the U.S. sought to eliminate sovereignty, so there had to be a hubris for people to access that sovereignty.
Okay, yeah, but our set of evidence explicitly distinguishes these conceptions of sovereignty, so you can't graft pre-existent political coherence to them. Can you explain now? How does colonization give coherence to the native?
Right, we're complicating your evidence articulation of how sovereignty is conferred. We're just saying.
Okay, so what is the theory of sovereignty that you're operating with then? What does it mean for a body or a group to possess sovereignty?
Right, that in the status quo, relationships of sovereignty are questions of, property in relation to how space, time, even subjectivity becomes something to be owned, proprietorship that is conferred, or the ability to place claim on that. In relation to, black subjects or those who complicate the notion of indigeneity, the that very technology of property is conferred to their being, i.e. they are unable to negotiate their relation to space and time.
Okay, the next card says that there's economic utility to colonization. What is the utility in scalping practices, kidnapping children for schooling, etc.?
Sure. First, what is it? Just wanna make sure I got which card are you referencing?
There's a second card in the 1NC. I can read the
Oh, word, yeah, you're talking in reference to your SEDEF.
settler
11
occupation as a
Yeah, your
utility.
SEDEF 11 evidence articulate. One, I think we're going to complicate this notion of sort of like, you're going to go for a gratuity spin of violence. We will articulate, obviously, that there were some forms of violence that were met at the flesh of natives, but there's also sort of, or the indigenous, but there's also sort of a cross relationship of sovereignty, power relations to demarcate space. I.e. the SEDEF 11 evidence articulation that, Cree citizens, engage in the active process during treaty building of saying, hey, not just kidnapping our children, but settler, part of the treaty is take our children, teach them the ways of the settler so that they can be competitive in the global framework, i.e. that they can be relational to the settler. We will say that's a relationship
What is the end of the
that, black people didn't have access to. Your evidence says that.
What is
I'll
the
read
end of the
code
world?
for it. What's up?
What is the end of the world?
Refusing, engagement or relationality to whiteness.
Okay, what does it mean in the Coulthard evidence to have the colonizer confront the psychological effect of settlerism?
Right, so I think the articulation I was giving in the SEDEF evidence probably, complicates the notion that indigenous people need to recognize individual colonization also produce anti-black policy.
have 5 judge panels and some of them have 3.
I think there's only one with 3.
I'm seeing 2. The Rutgers Emory round and the Wake Kansas round.
I think the Rutgers Emory round is because someone didn't show up, so they eliminated another judge as well.
That would suck.
But I also don't know that for sure.
That's weird to me.
Sometimes they do it to balance preferences. If one preference is too far over on one way, another judge trying to equalize it. So,
Someone trying to explain to John how preps work.
Shut the fuck up. We're talking about why are there 5 judge panels and 3 judge panels in this Octo? Do you know, Mr. Smart Guy?
Yeah, actually no, yeah. It's the case and then the K. Is anyone dying?
Hold on a second.
Sure, sit.
Jay, you good? Okay.
The nexus question for this debate is about the role of struggles of sovereignty. The alternative rejects those, and the after defends them. Vote affirmative to the politics of treaty contestation and strategic orientation for political organizing. We should theorize the history of colonization, treaty relations between the U.S. and indigenous people as a form of environmental change. There are 3 net benefits to voting affirmative: A, sociogenic violence, treaty relations, and environmental destruction at the heart of issues of indigenous survival, health issues, socioeconomic of toxic industrial waste, and destruction of plant ecosystems are all at stake in the conflict over treaty rights. Second, colonialism isn't just about indigeneity. It also produces the erasure of black spatial relations that are the basis for collective black organizing. For example, the Black Land Project research non-sovereign relations to the land for things like urban farming in places outside Flint. The alternative leaves those that allows those to be disavowed. That's white B. Political organizing. It just treats such space by which powers negotiate and implicate all sets of relations to the land, centering the necessity of rectifying treaty relations as a critical line. Colonial mechanisms that are legal arrangements or smoke screen of genocide that set up. C. The crisis used in false states constantly in a state of precarity attempt to hide the limits of imperial violence foundation through making claims of accommodating indigenous sovereignty. The affirmative exacerbates that state of precarity to crisis by taking that claim to its extreme by working towards the recognition of treaty rights that enables indigenous self-determination, creates a vulnerability and strategic space that allows indigenous activists to occupy and disrupt the dominant metapolitical matrix, opens the Pandora's box of debt owed by settlers to indigenous people, enabling contestation of the very idea of responsibility itself. The affirmative collapses the notion of sovereignty altogether. That's Rifkin, the K. Case outweighs this massive global resistance to the alternative. The preponderance of resistance movements against extermination are based in land struggles against ethnic colonialism. The preponderance of black politics, not only the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, but Aborigines in Australia, fights against African colonization in South Africa, etc. Permutation due both. The argument that the slave bodily non-relation precedes indigenous relations to the land obscures settler colonial function is denying very fleshy into indigenous populations to inhabit land. Smith in 1480 states articulated is concerned primarily the conversation with black studies concerned with rights within transcontinental situated potential sense native people can win condemnation to nation that must be native. Proximity to whiteness should not be understood. The pathway free, but also pathway to genocide. Nations are supposed to experience in order to effectuate genocide. People disqualified from being discovered. Things not working. People think ontological status things to be discovered. That's nature. Indigenous genocide. Product experience of British slavery. The experience of British labor helps secure black culture, but you all black labor has been used to build themselves. The anti-black cannot be equated with labor. Exploitation working black peoples can constitute labor. Representative colonies of people's only labor create poverty. To say disappearance of British labor that justifies the indigenous land flows driving the black people as non-labor. The relationship between fungibility, disparity of indigenous labor, rests on the commodification of land property. Anti-colonial struggle under false terms. It's only real challenge who owns land has the right to govern rather than challenging the idea that the land should be property at all. And their land falsely equates indigenous political movements with metaphysics. Movements like Idle Lamore instead working towards alternative good intelligibility. Smith and 15 concept should not reducible to alternative land, alternative good intelligibility. The quite radical break from Western epistemology, the 20,000 years old social farm, where indigenous people said the one nation, want to put table things, the nation, take me see Western epistemology stuff because I know who I am, because I'm not you. If I know what my nation is, because I'm your nation, will be constituted in relationship with all the nation, what's being articulated something radically different. It's a complete end to the world to be on, a complete reaching a constitution of who you even deem to ourselves to be innocent and affectionate and thought. The native struggles and fiddling noble and fiddling capital management. The constitution determines gesture towards the thing. We cannot see this. Speaks in fact of the general brings to a world a new brings into being a new world constituted on radical relationality. It will impact on their theory. One, it relies on a violent scripting of subjectivity and agency to indigenous people. The cross-examination of the two entities demonstrative of this. Their explanation of how things like forced assimilation, some consider weren't an example of reduced violence because indigenous folks wanted to be their kids to be more white, which is a misunderstanding of how assimilationism, which presumes the process of consent and assimilationism, which does not occur, and the land is the basis for the human colonization. Isn't about the theft of land, but making land itself. Smith and 15, which question the colonization about the theft of land, and colonization is ultimately about the return of stolen land, colonization about the creation of land, the creation of the human self, the structural relationship between human and not human to exist. The distinction between the human and land must be made meaningful before the possessed of land. There must be the creation of something called land that can be stolen. The natives not exist in the midway point of the human and the not human. The creation of the natives, creation of the good of intelligibility, promise the intact relationship between the human and the not human can even exist in the indigenous marks. Creation of the division between the living and the dead, the division between the human and the not human. The native never actually exists. Trace for different good intelligibility. It must always be disparate to whiteness, disparate to blacks, native self not existing. Good native trace for intelligibility by which the boundaries between land, creation of humans, and things become meaningful. This divide presumes that nature has the status of being a thing, and any analysis of raciality must concern itself with the introduction of the signification of nature itself. And the libidinal economy arguments are wrong. One, there's no basis for generalizing it to the entire collective conscious. Two, if we want to structure conditions of the human, then i.e. that is based in the land, it comes prior because the very terms that the libidinal economy assumes, i.e. that there are humans that rely on specific psychosexual investment, is problematized by the notion of how the human comes to being in the first place. It also cannot account for things like black indigenous folk in the United States, and their culture argument is problematic for them. It defends strategies not based on recognition, i.e. strategies like Idle Lamore, which would be contradictory with their wilderness and evidence. It also assumes a demand for constitutional rights, not the move to collapse sovereignty, and we link to this argument day in 13. The liberal multicultural agenda that any indigenous refusal of colonial politics recognition, which is deeply sensible projects frankly incompatible with the indigenous act scholarship that emerges from native studies in North America. This main argument in culture acts categorically reject the liberal recognition-based approach. It's not a political legitimizing the indigenous nation, state recognition, rather one of refuse to be recognized as interpolated by some colonial nation, state, and culture described the necessity on the part of the press to turn away from the other oriented mass dependency to a struggle of their own terms, difficult to reconcile the emphasized narrative research of the country that wants to section stripping to indigenous sovereignty, the face of the more the indigenous sovereignty movement, Canada's national way, and how we blockade the citizens, state policy, expropriation, natural resources, the global market, their examples, the culture describes direct action of the negotiation, tactics of not confidence, which these tactics are part of what Albert Spencer calls cartography views, then against the reality of more sign conflict and kidding names to struggle against the very practice of colonial capitalism. And culture makes an argument about the psychological, i.e. that it does the psychological investment in colonialism. The affirmative solves this, and the explanation that their evidence gives is that there needs to be an attunement to the violence of genocide. The affirmative solves that. Our Heller evidence says that the treaty is the site by which relationality can be theorized in this context, i.e. the ways in which humans are related to the event of genocide and the process of genocide. And social death is aspirational, not fixed and absolute. Brown in 9. While inside African economics brought attack social institutions that it maintains significant aspects of cultural background, here of its imagined, examined Africanism, practices of identifiably African as useful symbols of cultural survival that help analyze continuity of African American culture. Number of scholars involved in search for heritage, about heritage onto precise determination of continuity of worldviews, belonging, social practices, resistance, demonstrating basic humanity of the enslaved. What was known about chattel bondage now confirmed. Practices, definition of slavery. Slaves were generally dishonored. How does he explain to of rank among them? All group documented, they formed fragile families, documented if they have been alienated slaves who had been uniformly subjected to permanently violent domination. They cannot revolt as often is again records and out there flavor of transparency together with cultures, African economic values and cultural metaphors play the central record aim to reveal the perseverance of African culture among the second, third, and fourth generation Creole record, representing context of slavery, socially dead, resistance, expression of culture, people, what is the outcome of resistance, even of bondage, antithesis of black salvation rather than as constituted a part of it, that resistance was the crucible in which black people forged identity, the agency, the weak, and the power of the strong have too often been viewed as simple opposites. And their focus on social death is absolute instruction, normalizes geography, the violence, and relies on the spectacularization of black and indigenous death. Blackness isn't ungeographic, but only rendered as such through anti-black and settler colonial violence. This ignores the myriad of black searches of places that are the necessary basis for resistance. Born in 16 to this only through readings of the dead, risk creating screens of subjection. The dependent spectacularization of black pain and approach has to reject narratives dependent on natural geography to balance that. Calculate black life only in terms of social death. Symptoms of the lace provide a model that emphasizes interconnection, practical privileging narratives of resistance, through which life endures rather than depending on the spectacularization of black. Acceptance notion is a methodology of future detached territory drawing connection to shared place rather than shared violence. This means an entirely different understanding of space, naturalizing when the spatial arrangements that are building resistance movements details not only set dominant paradigms of knowledge, but some being attuned to the ways of being situated beyond dominant discourses and methodologies, highlight the relationship between combination of material and match geography, to which black women are unfit by bringing to focus geography. Personal and collective histories are bound up in a place where these spatial language not to claim spaces their own spatial dimensions of black and death are directly tied to a place about black women naming places and acting naming the self for indication of land police. A blood complicated out of arithmetic of long rather simple claiming she invokes the demonic facets of the demonic ground, regression, rejects violence as the final contour of self-liberation, signals from resistance and spatial turns through multiple readings. She's able to invoke land as process. Black women use spatial cosmologies for this violence, ongoing geographic struggles in time with meaningful language, how transplanted people survived Holocaust slavery, the poetics of landscape of black women to critique the boundaries of transplanted slavery, write national narratives, free spatialized feminists, develop new pathways, spatial clues, gesture towards geographies that are physical and claiming of land poetic landscape and not derived from desire for socioeconomic possession, but rather grammar of liberation. And their understanding of dysphoria as a primary relationship between blackness and the land precludes the geotheorizing of blackness that's essential to make future possible. Top guest and Cell 1014. The implication of settler colonialism and anti-blackness, part of collaboration of arts between settler colonialism and anti-blackness towards the future Blackland Project was founded to amplify, renarrate, and regenerate relations of black people engaged with land, participants engaged in geotheorizing black relationships with land by European work has been informed by academic theorizing of anti-blackness, settler colonialism, some black optimism, futurity, and useful to presume that from wherever those theories came, Blackland works has come to engage theory because they may be useful in translating the many ways of blackness persist to make relationships with land. The remaking of land to property is accompanied by the remaking of African persons to property to channel, the remaking of land embodies the properties that are settlement onto other people's land. According to settler colonialism, black people must kept landless and exceptionalized in settler communities, manifestation of property multi-communal sports of ownership, having things and owning lands and being territories, possessing some and all narratives, displacement struggles over them being the place that geographic dimension or to practice of black and reclamation, the legacy, or future dispossession, underwrites how we have come to know space and place and the connection between what are considered real valuable forms of ownership, boundaries, racial codes, and mark bodies on geographic, breaking property and ownership, assumptions and populations, and colonialism and anti-blackness, among theorizations of blackness and future anti-blackness value, in excess blackness is fungible, the work of Blackland Project coherence with military theories of black future practice, big interest, theorizing of black's life is on geographic, POP insists that on the acumen of black people's interrogation of related to land seeking definitions of black and beyond accumulation, fungibility, black and project engaged, interviews to co-construct black and resistance interviews at the ever circulating tropes of black people at St. Louis. Yeah.
Alright. Your evidence articulates that treaties are forms of articulation and buttress, and this is, responding to Wilderson and Sexton's understanding in neighbor studies, that treaties are forms of articulation and buttress the interlocutory life of America is coherent, albeit genocidal, but such a depoliticized liberal project is frankly incompatible with indigenous activism and scholarship that emerges from neighbor studies in North America. Then goes on to cite I Don't Know More as being disruptive to the very technology of, settlerism and recognition. I guess what exactly does I Don't Know More do?
Like what do they do in practice, or what do they do in
context.
theories? So for example, one thing they do is blockade the flow of resources in the Canadian settler state, i.e. they do things like eco-touch, etc.
Awesome. So I want to get to that. So the evidence isolates blockades, but I Don't Know More's manifesto isolates that they seek to repeal provisions like Bill C-45, that they seek, constitutional amendments in terms of the United Nations Declaration on Rights of the Indigenous, set up boards for, establishing policies so that, natives can be found if missing, etc., all in accordance with the Constitution. So I guess what part of that is disruptive to the very technology of sovereignty?
So our evidence makes a distinction of I Don't Know More strategies between recognition and negotiation, i.e. they are in negotiation with the settler state. They say that there are demands that need to be rectified, but it's not at the means of recognizing sovereignty. It's at the means of disrupting the coherence of the very idea of sovereignty.
Answering the question. All of those things sound like very, basis of interacting within the constitutionality or the idea that the state governing body.
The thing about I Don't Know More is that
what about those strategies, which root themselves in like the core of seeding the political, is anti-political.
Well, so the thing about Idle No More is that the manifesto, even if you go on to read it, all of their political strategies are within the frame of sovereignty itself is a construct, and that these are tactical mobilizations. So we will defend all of those things as essential tactical mobilizations put into crisis
It talks about
sovereignty.
blockades in a context of peaceful revolution, because blockades are able to produce not just disruption, because that disruption can't be sustained, but
Wait, who
recognition
says
in terms of
Where did you get
like,
peaceful from?
This is on I Don't Know More. It's like
Okay, they're not.
in terms of strategizing.
I would not say that they are peaceful. That
Right.
might be something they put on their manifesto, but that's probably a tactical maneuver.
Okay, whatever. I guess that your Brown 9 evidence talks about social death not being fixed in relation to blacks having relation to place. What does that place look like?
Well, it's a connection to the space they occupy and form community on outside of the relation of ownership and property.
How does that respond to the nature of gratuity?
Well, it responds to the social death aspect. And the idea that the gratuitous violence stuff isn't inconsistent with the link arguments about place.
That's not what that's. How
They
does that
don't.
respond to gratuity?
So that's not the part of social death that we have is inconsistent with.
Thank you.
It makes more explicit this.
You can do like another like 3 more inches. Sorry.
revealing structural antagonism and indifference to the smooth functioning of Americans, and they stay rooted in both the land of red peoples and the flesh of black bodies, revealing God's epistemology aimed towards the destruction of the entire modern world as we know that is revolving around the axis of black subjugation in the name of white life, as says blackness exists in a permanent state of nature in order to formulate a reference point to define humanity of both settlers and junior partners of this reigning civil society, i.e. Appealing towards the human life of one group structure trace off of the death of slavery of black flags. Our Wilson evidence speaks to how slavery is institutionalized by Spanish missionaries refusing to enslave Native Americans because they had an understanding of land divided by religion, resulting in the exportation of slaves, affiliate the animalized labor, which means only a world without America can ever be ethical, which is why your ballot, which should be called for the end of the world by stripping America of its moral coherence, its viable country, for the huddled masses of the possibility of wholesale revolution against the white body and politics in opposition to the continued murder of those individuals against the people. It structures violence against, which means the affirmative attempt to appeal towards the political discussions between white life and humanity or non-junior partners. It is a reason why it structurally adjusts the nation state and restores the smiling face on American tiny, i.e. their attempt at progress shifts the point of black suffering from slavery to the chain gang wars to the very existence to the way that to fucking things like drone trucks on African nation states, which is the very when our argument is the very existence of America justifies wilderness and that justifies things like genocide. That was all the wilderness and evidence of when it sees provisional grounding and repeating certain acts of establishing communities for analyzing different cases only requires very direct negotiation with the state. Their day evidence says that Texas and Wilson are wrong in terms of hostility, i.e. because of things like I don't know more did shit like blockades that fucked up global commerce. We have two implications. These blockades only become a liberal mode of protest, i.e. we can take to the streets and then produce momentary disruption when our argument is we need to question and refuse stability and antagonize the state's apparatus as a whole, even through the measure of things like accountability. They also have conceded that their notion of responsibility assumes that the state apparatuses need to come to an agreement or understand that they are the settler, and then space can sort of be relentlessly opened up, which ignores the hierarchical relationship between that which has been sort of given just to be taken, i.e. the relationship, the liberal status that natives sort of occupy between genocide and humanity, and then that which is denied the hubris of access to that relationship. Our argument is things like reparations, treaties, negotiations is all a process that begins within an ordinal point, i.e. the literal removal of nations' homes, property. They had claimed to this, proven by the cross-examination when they said the United States sought to destroy or eliminate that sovereignty, which proves there have to be a hubris of access to that sovereignty in the first place, which presumes a particular type of space. Our argument is that blacks do not occupy that space, that they are created via literal dispossession of that space. We do not have the receipts for things like dispossession. We occupy a space that is not intended for us. Their right argument pending responsibility is only based on having receipts for those dispossessions. Their right evidence makes a distinction for the demand itself, i.e. sovereignty operates within a paradigm of reciprocity, i.e. we have done violence, therefore we pay you. Our argument is this is only conferred with, this is only conferred for those individuals who are human as opposed to the individual, as opposed to the literal taking of the property, which proves the one is a discourse of recognition via the internal violence conceded, all the sex and evidence, which means the literal reappropriation of that sort of here in debate is how black flesh sort of becomes regrafted as a process to sort of be juxtaposed against sort of other bodies. Is also the political responsibility is only in terms of things state v state, which means that even if they win a sort of circumvention argument about how political responsibility is sort of situates blackness back into a place where when a masochism did that because they sort of force black individuals or any individual who has a tie to land to sort of stay on the world in which that violence is coherent against them, instead of rather leaving the world in which that sort of makes sense. They settled those relationships to the indigenous was one of cultural genocide, a kind of convergence that was forced as a process that operated because it cleared those sovereign states sought to produce relationships with the settler, and they have conceded that this is a literal process, i.e. we can take your children and sort of teach them the ways of the settler, when our argument is that anti-blackness operates as a literal, operates on a duality of expulsion and inclusion, which means which means all of their arguments about how sovereignty, the indigenous is not, their understanding of sovereignty through indigeneity is not the status quo. They conceded that there is a hierarchy established via the relationship of power, that the treaty operates as a will of purchase to property, defines the parameters of that purchase or the parameters of use of that particular property. Their very understanding of governance to convey things based off things like proprietorship only operates off the liberal telos that makes blacks captive in the first place, i.e. treaters are good only so far as they define a space for us. Our argument is that we must be a project of complete disorder. That crazy nonsensical call to refuse the nature of colonialism itself, so it means their notion of sovereignty and treaties only operates as a vehicle within colonialism and anti-blackness. They try to shift to how the settler begins to clear land and space, and our argument is that whiteness does not operate via the deregulation of space, but on the very grammar of regulation, the very grammar of defining what space is, and then placing regulation upon that space, i.e. you get this part of land, and we get this part, which is not a complete access to land, i.e. the rest of that shit is ours, which is all of the liminal status arguments I was making about their idea of point treaty as a rigorous, open, intended process looking to unsettle claims is just a particular, they conceded that treaty so occupies within a particular document to sort of be named. They are saying we need to establish a theory and then look at that critically. This is how we can sort of reshape and reform the status quo. This does not grapple with how we sort of come to know the treaty, which is the politics of negotiation arguments I'm making about, which they are only inherently parasitic to black sociology because it always comes at the bargaining of black life. That was all the first piece of Wilson evidence that says that black individuals live in a different context of violence, that there is a psychic grounding wire that sort of enables neurophobia and necrophilia to be constantly applied to them. There's no answer to this in the 2AC, which means you should have a high threshold for their understanding or their pushback against the libidinal economy debate. I'll get to that a little bit later, which means all other provisions are grounded in repealing certain acts or establishing communities or committees for analyzing different cases. All of this just requires direct negotiations. With to say that was all the stuff I made above conceded most of the warrants for the Wilson 16 argument that their dialectic approach to lump black individuals with people of color is the only premise on the idea that we can utilize things like capital or cured violence to represent the immaterial libidinal economy that black individuals are put through, which is how rules of analogy just said, i.e. how they sort of draw analogous representations, i.e. black people can sort of be subsumed under the hyper-exploitation of land and labor subsumption, yet still remain indebted to humanist ontologies, i.e. the rationality, the cultural, the symbolic culture, all central to the violence of settler occupation, which means they pervert a politics of culture instead of a culture of politics, i.e. the one is interest in preserving those indigenous self-determination over the relational axis by which indigenous violence is sort of imbricated to, which means their investment in that relation is how ontological convergence dilutes cultural-oriented practice because they ignore the precedents for reparations, i.e. the last piece of Wilson cards that says in order for violence to be articulated within treaty and sovereign relations, there has to be that hubris of access which simultaneously includes iterations of violence located at the periphery while over-determining a barring from the culture of being, which is how they lead from the pathogenic to the pathological. That was all the Wilson argument, all the Wilson evidence that says the process by which some society becomes antagonistic to no is how precarious subjects are inextricably woven into a world which pathologizes blackness for its inability to register itself as human, which is why we can sort of disavow that by reversing or inversing that. So even if they win their theory of power, they conceded that we can resolve the grafting process by which blackness is sort of imbricated into. They conceded a couple key arguments. One, that the diaspora via things like Africa has been dispersed from a place that has no sovereign things like no sovereign corporeality, and that negrophobia is a libidinal fear of the presence of blacks, which means that natives always stand in antagonistic relationships with whites via genocide, i.e. the Indian is just a positional non-commensurate, but rather blackness is positioned in a paradigm of antagonism where things like Choctaw and Loctaw are all indigenous things that are all the cultural ties that blackness does not have, which is how there is an inherent privilege when it becomes to how civil society works to a sort of contained indigeneity via things like integration, tech, prior ownership to land. Proves the liminal status argument I'm making about now. You can sort of go to all the libidinal claims they're sort of making at the end of the debate. They have no argument about how this process is sort of utilized as an indeterminate factor for sort of survival work. They've also conceded a big argument that anti-black fantasies have objective value, i.e. if I'm not black, I can fantasize about that blackness. I can sort of reach beyond my own collective bigotry in order to make that real, i.e. I have a relationship to with blacks that don't have. This is the psychic integration of people who suffer from white supremacy, which means that they have conceded that natives sort of depend on these fantasies in order to sort of project themselves into a coherent status of legislation, which is all the reason why we'll juxtapose this against all of their arguments about treaties, which means even if they win their theories of power, the sort of implication to focus on treaties is something that is bad and leads to a death of disposability, which is why that thinking through that process is bad.
You can sort of context.
Sure.
I want to ask about two phrases that 2NC used. First, what is the grammar of regulation?
The process by which whiteness sort of seeks to regulate things and then deregulate other things.
Or what does that mean in the context of the land, which is or space?
Well, my argument is that natives sort of occupy a liminal status between i.e. humanity and an antagonistic relationship to blacks.
What does that have to do with the grammar of regulation?
That's how regulation operates and inclusion, but it
what does it
also
mean for
works
blackness to be the permanent state of nature?
What?
What does it mean for blackness to be the permanent state of nature?
That's the whole regulation debate I just explained.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the alternative. What happens when the judges say that America has no moral coherence?
obviously nothing happens clearly by the cross-examination, which proves that you have to be a continuous repetitious
so then
opening
what
up of
political
space.
strategies are
Our argument is
informed by
that we have to
CE?
sort of disavow that the one he sees opening of space actually produces any tangible or material or discursive or social change.
So then what's the consequence of that for?
Right, Wilson says that, like, you know, the ultimate call of how to be the ultimate stick-up artist of the world is to be like, say, fuck coherence in every instance.
saying, what is the
to a degree, like,
consequence of that?
what?
What is the consequence? You're just re-explaining.
There's no
what
consequence to that. Our argument is that your
Okay, so
ability
why so
to
negative?
leave black individuals and natives stuck to the land is bad, because then you're like, well, the violence that they're sort of imbricated into doesn't matter. We shouldn't take, steps to sort of
So
disavow
the
ourselves
arguments
from
that
that.
you made about the receipts, how does this reconcile with the 1NC alternative card about reparations?
What are you talking about?
The argument
They
about-
coincide pretty well. The blackness does not have the receipts to sort of articulate, i.e. there has to be a hubris for, there has to be an equitable relationship
Yeah, but
between what has been
reparations-
given and what has been received.
reparations
That blacks do
still
not occupy them.
implies responsibility.
Wilson says the
still
reparations
implies
movement, he
receipt.
moves away from the word reparation because he understands blacks do not occupy that. Like, they
Okay,
cannot exist without that relationship.
So the 2EC and the 1EC's argument is that responsibility itself is a fiction. So how do your link arguments apply?
That's our argument, is that if you think responsibility in of itself is a fiction, then your inability to grapple with that is something that you have sort of promoted via the discourse of the 1AC. You have to keep understanding that, responsibility is fiction, but that doesn't
But it's not
actually
about
do anything.
understanding responsibility.
If it's not about
It seems like
understanding, then
your
what
argument
do you
is that we
do?
need
What
to
does
remove-
voting F do?
Okay, it seems like your argument is that
Voting
we
F
remove
does
the
not do
moral-
anything.
It seems like your argument is that the alternative removes
should vote
the
negative on
moral
presumption.
coherence. You're gonna let me ask my question. Your argument is that the alternative removes the moral coherence of things that suture
Like the
forms of
F.
violence.
Yeah.
Okay, so why isn't our argument about removing the moral coherence of responsibility?
Because you don't do that.
Okay. How does Wilderson know that anti-blackness is libidinal?
Okay, well, I've made a couple of arguments about how there are individuals who can sort of be more racist than others. There's also this sort of psychic integration that's sort of hardwired into us via necrophobia, necrophilia, presence of fear, blacks. Right.
framing for your ballot, their white instead of evidence assumes that there should be a convergence of ideas between civil society and indigenous. This is precisely the politics of recognition and freedom, predicated on anti-dialectical view of discourse, which allows for modal colonialism outside of relation to space, with the literal acceptance of the master's presence in the world, which produces the very assimilatory violence of the world and loves to colonize and not only to negotiate within a treaty practice, but reinvent the modes. Violence means all of you colonializers, i.e. the white people who have a ballot in their hands, must refuse the input of convergent affirmatives because the very technology and responsibility of one that imposes your presence, possibility of freedom, field liberalism, their own day evidence is citing thought is the reason why natives must refuse the very technology relationality to the world, but their only example of this process is the idle no more movement. The idle no more movement literally says our message is clear in accordance with the principles of coexistence, mutual respect between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, i.e. that there should be a relation or a convergence between the two sovereign powers between states. The affirmative isn't a deconstruction of sovereignty, but rather acquisition in a way in which property is delineated between two sovereign powers means that the notion of the master has a purchase to the place which dispossesses the very possibility of freedom means we have a serial policy failure to set that they still grossly mishandled. You can vote negative for presumption to refuse the logic that you should even have a seat at the table. You should even have a seat at the table because our retard evidence talks about the ways in which that allows for the colonizer to reinvent themselves insofar as they are able to articulate that their presence is validated, that their presence is articulated. The day evidence is also problematic on this question because the day evidence concedes that we need to be a removal away from the theorization of the treaty praxis because the treaty itself isn't an actual refusal but articulates the ways in which we need to be an impossible demand to the state already articulate how the I don't know more example is a complication of this, which means that the alternative only is the only one that has the only theory that has the possibility to access the possibility for rupture in various symbiotic relation between the master and the slave, which is a politics of dissonance. They don't get a permutation of method debate because they seek to create a condition of relation between the black and the world, i.e. the pedagogical creation of land to dump us on. This is the function of civil society to consume and incorporate blackness while simultaneously expelling black life from the world. The permutation sustains your pedagogical life at our death means we access to settlerism, proximity dissat that is impacted via the Cathar evidence that I'm articulating above means any risk of a link means not only that they don't get a permutation, but also they lose this debate on face value because they're the very politics of incorporation of sleuthing that one that their violence is able to structure ours produces a kind of disaffect to the way in which property is delineated onto the flesh of blackness. Gratuity means that all of their contingent examples as to how black possibility is created through places non sequitur in that relationship. Now they say that when we say that black indigeneity complicates the very notion of treaty practice, i.e. black Cherokee Nation people inclusion for the registry of indigeneity, the black Wampanoags lack treaty practice given their forced relation to space and state treated as property of the literal black indigenous who in South America prior colonization via Ivan Van Sertima's research that we made research will make captive despite their claim to place in a process of dispossession turns to Smith's evidence articulation about settlerism making land but rather demarcates the lines of land via property of the black, which is why treaty practice is not intended for us. This is all delineated by the ability for the sovereign to be or the indigenous to be able to make claims to what they are able to produce sovereignty over, which is exactly why reparations movement is extendable to non-black subjects, but it isn't extended to the black subject. A couple examples of this is the way in which Japanese were able to seek reparations because their claim to displacement was literal removal of their homes during removal from their homes in internment camps during World War II. The ability for the indigenous to even lay claim to spatialization or a relation to space, i.e. treaty praxis is one that's predicated on a very relation of space or property. Now they make an argument that blacks have a relation of place, which is a possibility for sociality via their brown non-evidence, but our Ruderson evidence articulates that is only a contingent mode of freedom that never bypasses the gratuity of the violence. I'll give an example here. The way in which the Colombo Center in Oakland, California, is literally under the process of being taken from those black revolutionaries who are doing farming co-ops like the affirmative articulates outside of Flint is problematic because the very reasons that those spaces are being taken from them is because they do not have the documentation of the property or the claims of property to say that that is a space that they have sovereignty over, which complicates the very notion in which blackness operates as a tool of sovereignty, operates as a tool of property in that relationship means that any possibility that is afforded to the affirmative is a possibility that cannot be afforded to the negative. Black space, our relation space is liminal. I already do that articulation above, which is the reason why you can articulate this as a black spatialization dissent, because even if we are given our contingent relation to violence that doesn't remediate the way in which gratuity functions, I are witnessing evidence to articulation of the way in which civil society seeks to incorporate blackness but also expose it, which the literal neo-lynching of black flesh, even when they have claim to a production of space and place, which means that we have a voyeurism dissent because they don't deal with the martyrdom sex and evidence, which becomes an easy tiebreaker. Their belief that discussion on subjective level vote affirmative because our discussion is good and effective, and vacuum somehow shifts the structural symbiotic economy and sutures gratuitous violence into the politics that feeds the economy of black death for white life, i.e. black suffering becomes a mode of consumption within it. Academic spaces only feeds the liberal subject needs to say by simply talking about it they did something good, which is disavow that violence on systemic branches self-disserves and independent impact that they haven't resolved at the point where they haven't articulated what your ballot, how your ballot operates within a process of treaty praxis, how it resolves into the intermediate forms of violence, not only within the pedagogical space, but the way in which violence is met at the flesh of black and the native means that they inevitably produce reconstruction of the liberal subject, the cathartic.
I think it's like naturally cut.
start on the case, then the permutation, and then the 2 and C. Is everyone ready? Yep. Cool. The next question for your ballot is a stance on struggles for sovereignty. The affirmatives method believes that we were able to impinge upon processes that incorporate and destroy the indigenous struggles for sovereignty, whereas the negative says that you should reject them as recuperative moves towards regenerating the world. This has three moving towards these strategies has 3 benefits. The first is sociogenic violence. They've conceded that the settler state works through a method of legitimacy through the performance of law that incorporates and assimilates indigenous politics in order to erase their spatial relations and modes of resistance by scaling them down to investment opportunities. The second benefit is about political organizing. They've conceded that the preponderance of global resistance movements are based on a land relation claim that is true from indigenous resistance in Canada to South Africa. Their distinctions about different forms of land relations may be true at the level of the theory, but we have arguments about how political benefits emerge from organizing around the question of sovereignty and treaty relations, which means you should vote affirmative for that value. The third is the crisis of sovereignty. They've conceded the Rifkin evidence that the demand for an outstanding responsibility opens a Pandora's box of claims that makes the settler state unable to ground itself in the ground of the nation, which ensures that the processes of impingement are slow. The permutation. The Coulthard evidence is decisively aff. Our day evidence rereads his claim and says that movements towards sovereignty claims are working against recognition of rights and freedoms. All of their link arguments here rely on a slippage between a European notion of sovereignty and an indigenous one. Our set of evidence explains that the notion of harmony or relationality that is present in indigenous cosmologies is not the same as cohering a multicultural polity in the settler logic, which means that this slippage is a violent scripting of those categories onto indigenous politics. You should reject their notion of a romanticized conception of resistance politics that allows your ballot to make a simple decision that can displace your power as a settler. Instead, our framework argument is that debate decides between competing political strategies which seek to challenge settler and anti-black modes of violence. If we win a solvency argument, you should prioritize that endorsement as a way of stemming the violence that emerges from your presence as a settler. The permutation should be allowed in method debates. It's not an incorporation of black life or their performance of the alternative, but rather tests they have been able to prove that the affirmative is a move towards recuperation of the world. So it's only a link question. They say the Japanese argument's not analogous to the position of the indigenous because they were not settled, but rather brought to this land. Now, even if black space is contingent and momentary, it is the fact that it is taken and not owned is our argument. The land relationship that black futurity activates is something that cannot be reduced to settler notions of property and proprietorship, so it is a momentary opportunity for a form of new futurity. I will do this more in the 2NC, but it proves they have misunderstood the claim we are making. It's not that black people own land because they have organic farms. They say voyeurism just had no link. We do not depict a gratuitous image of violence of indigenous peoples in the 1AC. The ballot cannot remediate this, and the alternative has no strategy to address it. 2NC. Are indigenous sovereignty struggles a move to recuperate the world? I don't think they have a good explanation other than an assumption of humanism that all of our evidence impact turns. The agency link arguments are directly responded by our Smith evidence. It says that proximity to whiteness for native peoples is not proximity to freedom, but a slipping towards genocide. The reduction of their land relationships to ownership is a settlerist erasure of their previous inhabitants' modes, which means that you should understand decolonization as an impossible claim towards an anterior form of freedom that has been eliminated. It is not a humanist reclamation of receipts that seeks to tally up lost property and reclaim it back. It is a challenge to the notion of property and ownership in the first place. It disarticulates humanism and the logic of owning land, which is in line with the end of the world. That's our argument about a different root cause for humanist ontologies through the thingification of the land. They say that blockades are a form of protest politics, but these groups have no faith in state recognition. It's a disorienting praxis that prevents the progression of settler development. They say the access, hubris of access. No argument about sovereignty being reliant on a document that legally recognizes. Our argument is that we should view those documents as a fiction in order to open up a recursive obligation that is generated through shared land relations that calls violence into question in history. There's also no agency to being recognized as a group. It's being folded into a violent relation. They say that we have a state-focused politics. No, Hitler says that the treaty establishes relations for interpersonal power, which is why the obligation is recursive. Additionally, you cannot just vote negative on presumption. The alternative needs to solve something through a form of political strategy that actualizes a move towards the end of the world. Otherwise, it is ethical purity that doesn't resolve violence, which is useless to deal with these structures. They say that, rules of analogy, no point of comparison. Our Tuck evidence says there was a unique status of black people to the land. The Black Land Project is the example that says that there is a form of land connection. Their focus on social death as completed, not aspirational, relies on a spectacularization of violence that means that they cannot account for things like African cultural practices that were key to slave revolts and new ownership. The Smith evidence has been extended above that there was a different root cause. Our Warburton evidence says that there is a fissure towards a new maturity of resistance politics.
How much time do you have left?
No, they're not starting. stand on sovereignty, they aren't dealing with the way in which your flesh as a white settler makes a relation parasitic to the way in which freedom is even possible. Freedom is only symbolic insofar as the very presence of the settler is the bargaining table of treaty practice, refights, authority argument that relies on recognition. That recognition is a form of power that legitimates the very presence of the master, which is why treaty practice does not resolve create conditions for complicating sovereignty, but instead recoasts their day. Evidence example of the idle no more movement proves that this it articulates that coexistence in mutual respect of civil society is attainable, which means they have not dealt with that question. They say the day evidence access is called but not nearly enough work in the 1AR day after recodification of blackness. All the examples I get from the 1AR shows the inadequacy of place, space, basis tied to remediate the violence of the slave, the Black Cherokee Nation, the Black South Africa, the Black South Americans. All of those examples proves that it proves also is the reason why they don't get a permutation method. They conceded a structuring power that flesh determines violence regardless. The accumulation becomes a repetition return to the phobic object, which is how blackness becomes a problem for civil society, i.e. the atomizing of liberalism proves that black death becomes insurmountable in debate. They also conceded the absence of politics and incorporation, that blackness operates on expulsion and inclusion, which is how pathologization of the affirmative becomes a violent settler, which is why our questioning the very existence of their space of this space in debate means they can't reconcile the exorbitant sites located between debate and their subject position, which is precisely how reclamation of redemption and the capacity for blackness means they can creating value that can keep opening up spaces for pending responsibility while allowing the violence featured of the black to keep having the masochism not answer to the 1AR, which means that even if they win an argument about how there are individuals who are tied to land, they conceded that there is a world in which we can remove ourselves from that sort of displaces the sort of technologies and grammars that sort of impose onto indigenous and black individuals' bodies. Conceded the ballot argument, which means that you do not have the jurisdiction or the technology or the responsibility in order to adjudicate whether or not they have sort of realized that violence, which is all of the arguments that they conceded that this relies on a politics of recognition and freedom, which is only a reinvesting of modules of violence. They become the very technology or responsibility, because also that was a culture card on the day evidence that says natives have to refuse this instance of relationality doesn't answer how there's a serious policy dissent, because even the idle normal movement operates within that politics of relationality, which is the permutation dissent. Conceded that blackness is an adamant captivity, which means that their 1AC Chris-Sexton evidence not answer, which means the socio-enunciated narrative will be enough to dismantle or challenge their structural implications is not true. They're an act of forgetting, i.e. they have to constantly return to a place before the dual notion of convergence, which means our argument is that this is how blackness as grafting flesh becomes proliferated exponentially. No answer to the libidinal economy debate. I'll get a little later, which means this is the misrecognition process of blackness, which is how the radical political act only ignores how blackness constitutes itself as a body to be more easily understood, which is the masochistic desiring to form an identity in order to be seen. The libidinal economy structure of the political economy is still foundational slavery, which is how the system is based on a compromise intended to accommodate ourselves, which means our flesh. To say the paradigm of demarcation conceded the white fantasies can be made real through things like through the blood bond can be made real through the psychic integration via how blacks are sort of suffer indeterminate experiences is different from everybody else, which is why blacks operate not in a disposability of death, but rather as a gratuitous violence, which is why all of them conceded that labor is a limited concept to understand how sort of individuals are tied to land proprietorship, which is why the 1AC becomes the site and motive incorporating non-black people into settler colonial relations, which is why their act only becomes a world in which labor becomes a discourse of proximity and citizenship within colonial state, which is why their assumption that blackness is purely tied to that land concedes that it was sort of removed from that land and then placed into another demarcation. That was the 2AC argument about how whiteness is operating in a politics of governance through incorporation, which is why which is the impact to the Sexton evidence that says that the political economy of debate is sort of mediates these objects, which is why their assumption that they can solve the 1AC through the social democratic procedure, it means they have just a self-adjustment process that predicates itself towards experiential freedom, when our argument is that Willishness says there's an ontological freedom that sort of proves the nexus question of the debate doesn't make any sense. They say nexus question conceded the strategic political organizing isn't the alternative, that i.e. the F does not result in that. All of our arguments about Willishness says we have to have a move to the end of the world, not restituting the world by which it has coherence. You say things like sociogenic violence conceded that indigenous or sort of occupy a liminal status between genocide and humanity, which answers and circumvents most of their arguments about how the Smith evidence says there's distinction. You say also you conceded that you assume that indigenous individuals have an instance of sentience. You've also conceded that that is not the world that black is sort of determined by a world of death making, which is why you leave niggas on land without leaving the world of coherence. You've conceded that black is a removal in space, like the literal reorganizing in space, which means even if they win a sort of internal link to how the world works, we resolve the grafting process, which is an external reason why you vote negative on presumption. You conceded that this is a liberal inclusion strategy because you lump blacks with people of color. Even if you said there's no theory to that argument, you've conceded that this is a rules of analogy that between the liminal status between genocide and humanity, you push black people towards that humanity, which is is how that's the Wilson evidence that says that we, instead of pathologizing blackness for its consumption of humanity, we have to pathologize humanity for its consumption of blackness, which is the inverse, which means we win those disasters. You can also, because the Smith evidence only says that black studies doesn't talk about colonialism. You conceded that the genocide in the freedom operates within those liberal status. Also, black is not just limited to labor. Their white evidence only assumes a possibility, a responsibility from the nation state, which is not dealing with the Carthage articulation of the wholesale refusal of validating the presence of the master slave. You can also vote for this shit because this only legitimates your existence in the world, which means the continued gratuitous violence on black flesh, i.e. neo-lynching, which means the after results in no niggas at the seat of unsettling treaties because we don't have relation to treaties in the first place, which continues the very technologies of blacks as the property of the world for demarcating property and space, which were fucking examples in the 1R, which turns the app into sexist, or articulation of liberalism, which also proves most of their arguments that they say violent scripting, but they conceded that this gratuitous violence of this world is sort of imposed on us. They conceded in a theory of power. You just vote presumption.
It was 7:41. You want to talk now, or should I do it? Just call me later. Yeah, I've already started before. So,
So it's the K with an overview, where the overview is going to do most of the case stuff, and then after the overview, I'm going to go to the social death debate, and then I'm going to start on top of the 2 and R. Alright, is anyone not good?
Settler colonialism outweighs its illogical elimination that denies the very humanity and corporeality of indigenous bodies to inhabit land itself. The tragic tactic of treaty contestation and struggles for sovereignty are the basis of the preponderance of black resistance globally. They have no answer to our global frame. The struggles like I don't know more than use treaty contestation are analogous and essential, as well as struggles like South Africans that are facing African or territorial grabs in places like the Orange River that literally push communities into extinction, land grabs in places like the Horn of Africa by BRIC countries and corporations, as well as Aboriginals in Australia who are faced not simply with enslavement but genocide and illogical extermination to deprive them of their relation to the land. These are all struggles against anti-blackness, against the extermination of black ways of life. You should care about these struggles against genocide and use debate to develop political strategy to resist them, not simply on the basis of presumption or ontological purity. Settler ontology is aspirational and most salient when it can eliminate any evidence of existence. Otherwise, the ways of life in which entire communities find value must be sustained to forfeit. And on the ground, oppositional politics in the sake of ontological purity is to let ontology complete its aspiration of extermination. We must sustain resistance to even have alternative ways of knowing, to know that there are outside to this world that the alternative can call for. The affirmative is strategic treaty contestation that will provide the fuel for these struggles itself. More significantly, they have dropped as essential to collapse all of sovereignty itself, which means the basis for most of their relationality, link arguments, and claims to humanism don't apply to the affirmative dependent responsibilities, a move that hijacks environmental movements demanding action to remedy climate change by taking out an even greater demand. Our Rifkin evidence says that the counter citation of indigenous sovereignty in a legal context is valuable because it exacerbates the structural crisis of legitimacy that the topos of sovereignty works to stimulate. This works within the contradictions of sovereignty, rendering the law inoperable, and demonstrates the nihilism at the basis of the law itself. This also means that you cannot vote negative on any of their presumption arguments, such as the act doesn't do anything because they have no account of this, specifically solvency arguments. Here is the real kicker: when we can lose all of our impact framing arguments and still win the debate on our Smith evidence alone. The entire account of ontology for the 2 and R's links, i.e. for the alternative, is based in even the libidinal Kanye arguments all rely is backwards. The thingification of the land is where the grid of intelligibility of ontology itself must exist for the structural relationship between the human and the non-human to exist. The distinction between the human and the land must be made meaningful. The indigenous is not the point between the human and the non-human, but rather it's the creation of the indigenous is how the grid of intelligibility upon which the metaphysical ontology and status quo gets its coherence. There's 2 implications for what this means to the debate. 1, it means that the alternative cannot solve it. Only the affirmative access their impact arguments. Decolonization isn't about the taking the land back, it's about the creation of new worlds outside of this one, and the end of the world itself. It's only through the idea of the land, it's only through the idea of the land that blackness is rendered landless in the first place. It's not a transfer of ownership, but a rupture of ownership itself. This means the negative balance the 2 and R tries to sell you on, and all of their link arguments about treaties, etc., do not apply because they only presume that we are investment in futurity as opposed to resolving the motor by which anti-black violence gains force. They might win some link arguments that there are reconciliatory parts of the affirmative. Even if this is true, these are necessary provisional strategies, the form of tactical trickery that opens up a Pandora's box for indigenous movements that attack the foundational basis for the settler state. Even if they win, there's arguments about reconciliatory language in our evidence. Intention doesn't matter in this context. Our argument is that sovereignty is like a poison pill. The move towards it is what collapses its own legitimacy. 2, it means that the DA to the alternative is massive. I'm going to do the majority of the social death debate here because it proves so many structuring issues that'll frame how you evaluate the 2 and R. Their theory of how social death operates as a mid-sized fact understands the fact that both aspirational anti-blackness works by saying that those without a political claim to the land have no kinship because the human is that which can thingify the land itself. This is why our decolonization arguments matter, because they demonstrate how we access and get to their impact arguments. They are the only ones that sustain social death operation. Social death is aspirational, not absolute, and to treat it as absolute is an act of settler colonialism, and you should conceive of social life as in the moments of resistance that are Brown Evans talks about. Africanism's cultural aspects are translated from Africa through slave culture and to modern culture can be seen in black languages and religious practices. General dishonorment, for example, does not explain existence of rank and file within slave communities when now this is particularly true in the context of land itself. You need our BLP evidence and our Warburton evidence. After the debate, they are examples of highlighting the fissures and cracks in the project of social death by demonstrating that a black relationality to the land is possible. It's not based on ownership, but instead a relationality outside of those things. In plantations, for example, slaves would steal seeds. The BLP today works with communities outside Flint in the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and North Carolina. Runaway slaves mapped out past the land. The question of the ballot is whether or not you focus on the homogenization and the aspiration of social death or those fissures within it by which resistance is possible, which our evidence is essential. Now, the first argument they make is that flesh as white settlers, the basis for freedom. Our set of evidence impact turns this on 2 levels. First, their own culture and evidence says that there needs to be a confrontation with the settler in the moment of genocide. Only the treaty relations implicate that altogether. Second, our evidence provides a role of settlers and indicates that they can sustain the political project of treaty consultation treaties. If we win any benefit to the in terms of case that way, if we leverage that against us. Now, we do get a permutation. We don't need it to win the debate, and it's not a method versus method debate. You still have to prove why the affirmative was bad, and all of our offense against the case demonstrates the necessity of the permutation because they necessitate the importance of colonization resolving their link arguments. Now, every link about relationality and recognition requires them winning the totality of their social debt theory, which is why I started there. The only way they could win their base arguments about the libidinal, the only way they can win their arguments about the libidinal economy, etc., is if they rely on some notion about social debt. They say the masochism DA. We don't force people to stay in the land. We are the masochism DA. We don't force people to stay in the land. Arguments that there's new futurities outside of the land altogether. Their totalization of social death links to the masochism DA because it's what spectacularizes death and for closest futurity in the first place. They say the arguments about refuse legitimate the existence of the settler. There's a palliative DA to this context. They've also conceded our framework argument about structural relations and political organization, which means that if we win that argument, then there's no way they can leverage it against it. You have to take account of how voting negative resolves any of these arguments. The settlers also aren't just judges. Settlers are the settlement isn't just limited to these and judges in this room. Settlement is their prior political category, which means that we have an account of how we resist that comes prior. Now, they've conceded our framework now. They say the libidinal economy argument. This was answered above. The root of the human is the settlement and the moment of colonization. If we have an account of that, that explains that. Additionally, our risking evidence is a different account of the libidinal economy because the fantasy of sovereignty is what sustains all of those operations. Only we access that.
session deadline is 10:45.
What time is it now?
10:20 something.
10:20.
Is it okay if we like sit there? Will it block anything?
I am right now.
Okay. I'm just saying bad things under my breath. That's not allowed on. Can we not stream the audio, please?
You want me to answer your Okay.
Thank you.
That's fine.
Because sometimes I say bad things under my breath. Well, out loud. So I prefer to say something.
Okay, so, alright, so I'll stop the stream now.
Thank you.
Unless
Sorry,
you-
America and other places around the world that might like also be. We actually have a novice who like did PF in China who was just like, I watched your debate and I was like, oh shit. He was like, I really didn't know what you were talking about, but I know who you are.